Welcome everyone to Core Conversations, the online series sponsored by the Association of Core Texts and Courses. I am Charlie Thomas, the Executive Director of ACTC, and we are glad that you have found us here today. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Mary Townsend. She's an assistant professor of philosophy at St. John's University, the one in Queens. We've had a lot of St. John's College folks on in the series this time, and in fact, Mary is a St. John's College person, but not at the moment. At the moment, she's an assistant professor at St. John's University, and so want to make that clear. Mary is I first met Mary through her writing. She wrote a fantastic book on Plato called The Woman Question. And I also work on Plato, and I've worked on the very similar part of the Republic that Mary focused on, but in a completely different way. And it was marvelous and illuminating. And I'm very, very much in her debt for all of the amazing work she did in that book. She writes generally on philosophy and culture, including having pieces placed in the Atlantic and the Hedgehog Review. And she continues to do academic work on Plato. But today, and I love this, she's going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir. So Mary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's really great to be able to talk to this community. I've always really enjoyed all the conversations that I've had at ACTC, and I'm really excited to talk about a text that may or may not be known to this particular community. Today, I'm going to be talking about Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity, which is a book that she wrote to sort of see if she could find a place for ethics and morality within existential philosophy, the philosophy that she and Sartre worked together to come up on. Sartre is known for saying that hell is other people. But so this book came out the same year as that play because she was trying to find a way in which maybe they're not. And I think she does a really good job of trying to show that if our goal, our existentialist goal, is some kind of freedom where we reach some kind of authentic self and understand ourselves in light of our responsibility towards our own freedom, we have a responsibility towards the freedom of others. So the book is a slow progress. It takes you from childhood through lots of different sorts of almost Hegelian dialectical progressions of character till you get to this place where you understand that your projects of freedom depend upon the projects of freedom of others. They intersect, they shape each other. You can't have one without the other. So I usually, I teach this book in the context of an ethics class, which is sort of a secret great books course, the way that I make it happen. I try to do all primary sources. I usually have a nice small group. And of course I do Kant and Mill and Aristotle and Nietzsche. And I pride myself on my ability to sort of roll people into a nicely Aristotelian place by the end of the semester. But there's something about, like normally I'm teaching this after I've taught Mill, Kant, Epictetus, Nietzsche. And I started tossing in Beauvoir, even though it smooshes the semester a little bit, because I wanted to see what would happen. And I also, there's a seriousness that takes place once you experience this particular book. I've taught in another context that it's really fascinating to watch. This is why I picked this book for this kind of conversation, because I know at ACTC we all love talking about pedagogy. And so if something fascinates students for good reasons, we love to talk about it and we want to know and think about it. So I found this book, it's like a top 3 everyone's favorite text. Like again, by the time I'm finished with them, they love Aristotle. Hopefully they love Plato as well. But yeah, there's just something about this book that I find that the way she talks about our current modern predicament, the way we relate to anxiety, despair, nihilism, political problems, problems of sort of personal choice, students start to really see that their problems are philosophical. And in fact, they're even metaphysical. There's a way in which you can't understand what nihilistic despair is unless you were trying to think about it in terms of being and your own being and your relationship to being. So it's really, in terms of like good philosophy, it is good. And in terms of really helping students notice that philosophy is actively helping them and not just kind of like vaguely interacting with their life, I think is really valuable. I'll note that I usually teach primarily like the first like 8 pages from the first chapter and then all of the second chapter, because those I think are the most descriptive and valuable parts of the text, and also they relate most immediately to something like Nietzsche and ultimately to Aristotle. So let me read you all the very first paragraph, because I just to get a sense of her prose and the way that she writes about this kind of stuff. So the book begins by saying, "The continuous work of our life," says Montaigne, "is to build death." He quotes the Latin poets, "Prima que vitam dedit, ora corpsit," and again, "Nascentes morimur." Man knows and thinks this tragic ambivalence, which the animal and the plant merely undergo. A new paradox is thereby introduced into his destiny. Rational animal, thinking reed, he escapes from his natural condition without, however, freeing himself from it. He is still part of this world, of which he is a consciousness. He asserts himself as a pure internality, against which no external power can take hold, and he also experiences himself as a thing crushed by the dark weight of other things. At every moment, he can grasp the non-temporal truth of his existence, but between the past, which no longer is, and the future, which is not yet, this moment when he exists is nothing. This privilege which he alone possesses, of being sovereign and unique subject amidst a universe of objects, is also what he shares with all his fellow men. In turn, an object for others, he is nothing more than an individual in the collectivity on which he depends. So I really think it's really well written. It's very poetic. And I think like when I teach it, I often just like put the text on the board, which I don't usually do. And we try to sort of riff, like her writing style kind of riffs through lots of different ideas. So I ask the students like, what lines stuck out to you? Instead of trying to like immediately like be like, here's an outline of everything. Can we put this together? We just sort of feel like, was there an image that stuck out to you? And people love the sense of being crushed by the dark weight of things, and yet also feeling yourself absolutely the only existing and powerful thing in the universe. I love the way that she sort of balances out both of those two sensations. So the reason for all these lovely metaphors is that she feels as though that it's very difficult for us as human beings to focus our attention on the fact that we will absolutely die. There's simply no question about it. That is true. It is a true thing. And yet our mind sort of skips away from this because it's a really difficult thing to process. And we end up giving ourselves sort of false attributes of immortality that tend to really mess up our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to others. She works with Sartre's definition of man as a lack of being, who has to make himself be in order to be at all. And she points out in a way that really reminds me of like Diotima's speech in the symposium, that there is a sense in which we know that we are imperfect. We're becoming, we're always fading away, like parts of us are flaking off into existence. But we're always trying to say like, no, I'm more being than I am. And she has a nice sort of Thomistic point here, having studied with French Thomists. She points out that if God is perfect being, there's no need for an ethics for God. He's already perfect. Just the mere fact that we're talking about ethics at all is pointing at something more than ourselves. Our very lackness makes it necessary for us to do something about it. So I think the next point that she makes is about our relationship to childhood, which I think will show us like how we start off in life thinking of morality and adults as having more being than they actually do. And then she starts flipping it into the individual characters as we reach sort of a crisis of being and realize that our being is more complicated than we initially thought it was. So she says that when we are a child, there's something peculiarly wonderful about that. And part of the human tragedy is that we're always reaching back towards the nostalgia that perfect state, in that like we come into the world, and she says that human customs, laws, morality, it seems to have the rock solid kind of organic being that a tree does or a flower. It is given to us. We take it as given. We exist in that world, but we're perfectly free from it because we don't have anything to do about it. We don't have to make decisions. We're mad that others make decisions for us, but there's this delightful irresponsibility She talks about delight in existence that the child has because they feel they can mess around, they can play. The world isn't serious for them. So in that world, adults are not just, responsible people trying to make difficult decisions for you. They seem to us to be gods. They seem perfect. They seem to have that overwhelming perfection of being that we assume someone does, that the world does. But fortunately, we, the children, we don't have to worry about it yet. The gratuity of existence is a phrase that she throws around. Some sort of extraness, to translate it into to some current slang there. That is a joyful thing and a delight. And we lose this as we realize that the world is imperfect and that we're imperfect. But she says that her philosophy and just sort of grasping of our own responsibility that our freedom gives us is something that allows us to reclaim the gratuity of existence. But so all too soon, obviously in adolescence, we realize that adults are not perfect. They're just human. Our beloved mentors, even like they're just, there's just little human things about them. And then you start to feel, oh no, that's true of the world as well. It's true of morality. It's true of customs, laws, every human thing. This part really reminds me of, I think, Republic 9, where Socrates is worried that this very same sort of shift into a disbelief in the customs that have been given to you from a child causes mythology in you. So she's going in a similar direction. So once we realize that we lack being, actually, and that we have this dreadful responsibility to kind of, in a way, do whatever we want with our freedom, since we are actually free, we have to make choices about it. Most of us kind of freak out at this point and give up. She calls this condition that of the subman, so somebody who has not allowed themselves to be fully human. And again, it is a sort of majority position, and students really love to brainstorm and riff on this part because it's very easy for them to come up with examples of like people who are so afraid of existing that they just find ways to hide the fact that they exist at all as a single individual. The classic example is Netflix, which is something that we all do. Art allows us to kind of like take a step away from ourselves, especially bad art, I think, honestly. And then students also point out that drugs, alcohol, things like these, like it's just a way of denying the terror that you feel when you realize that the world's not perfect, neither are you, and you probably should do something about it. So this sounds sort of like, it sounds sort of familiar, and it also sounds maybe trivial at this point. Like, of course, this is something we all do, hide our consciousness from ourselves and hide the fact of our deaths. But she points out that this is something that politics immediately takes advantage of, because people who have a specific idea about how life ought to be lived, allow themselves to take all these sub-men and sort of piggyback on the passions of other people. So she points out that all the great bloody wars, the pogroms, the Nazis, the fascists, all of these people depend on a large group of people who don't have their own fixed idea about what it is to be human and to be responsible for themselves. So they sort of ride on the passions of that kind of action. And again, students love to have come up with interesting examples of this phenomenon. They talk about like anger on online forums. So there's like there's one person who's like, well, I take a fixed position, against this. And then 30 people jump in and they're like, yeah, that's terrible. and so, we've all seen this. And it's not just college students, obviously, who experience this as well. But she points out that this phenomenon comes out by means of this imbalance between one person who's decided that this thing is important to them, and then like 50 people who are like, I feel aimless. Most of the time I don't think about stuff, but man, it'd be great to just be angry right now. So it's so descriptive and they love it. And it's a great moment for papers, because they can always come up with, like her examples are like post-World War II, immediate aftermath of like the German invasion of France and so forth. But like the students would love to sort of like be like online forum and different things about it. So that could be very valuable. So if you're not a sub person, the next stage is to see that there are values in the world and decide that they are worth, acting upon. But then the human being at this point makes a very difficult, wrong metaphysical turn. They give their cause, their idea, their moral absolute value. And so they say that this is the only one true thing in the world. Everything else is sort of subject to it. And you can tell when someone's made this wrong choice because they're willing to sacrifice other humans and specifically other human lives for their cause, which is absolute. So she says, for the general, this is his war. For the colonialist, it's his highway. Just bodies, doesn't matter. And she says, for the Marxist, it's the revolution. And for Christians, it can be the church. If you value your belief in this absolute objectiveness of what you consider to be good, you can tell you're doing it wrong if you're starting to say, well, that means we can harm people and we can sort of treat people as objects, as means to an end, and sort of railroad over them. So I really appreciate that part. I think students don't notice how even-handed she's being, but in the context of France at the time, like just being like, look, everyone does this. This is just a human psychological relationship to our metaphysical relationship to freedom. It's not necessarily about being Christian or being a Marxist, et cetera. It is just a relationship to how we view these things. And so ultimately her answer to this is something like, yes, certainly it is good if you think that there is some objective truth. That's a valuable thing. But you have to realize that you are sort of pinning your human gamble on that objectivity. Like, you think it's true, but what you have to realize is you are the person who is saying, you know what, that's what matters to me. I value it and I make it my value, which means there still is a fragility to it. There has to be a humility to our relationship to the way that we claim these things to be true. If I'm like, no, sorry, my truth, beats out all of the fragility of my own self and all the fragility of other human selves, like that is a problem. So she is trying to aim again, like to that balanced point of like, I see my freedom, I take responsibility by saying, yes, this is what I consider to be good. And also I have to respect that all of us should be attempting to do that same kind of thing. So here I think the next sort of character after Subman, Serious Man, comes the nihilist. And this is probably every student's favorite part because it seems to them to be so incredibly true. And then they also really see the connection to the metaphysics. So she points out that like when you, even the serious man at the end of his life can often realize, you know what, maybe the revolution wasn't everything I thought it was, or maybe my relationship to the church was like a little bit triumphalist. There can be this sort of horrible, again, existential crisis where you realize like I have pinned my entire life to a value which was not as perfect as I was able to really make it be. And at that point, again, it's that sort of Socratic moment of like, oh no, what if nothing is true? The way she frames it is conscious of being unable to be anything, man then decides to be nothing. We shall call this attitude nihilistic. He wants to be nothing, and this nothing that he dreams of is still another sort of being. Nihilism is a disappointed seriousness which is turned back upon itself. And she points out that in nihilism there is no joy. It's really nice because you can see that there's a fundamental contradiction if you're like, look, nothing's real. I'm not real, you're not real, I don't matter, you don't matter. There's a pain of the existing creature that's saying that because they still exist, but they're like, nothing is. And so the immediate sort of motion to action is like, well, I need to either negate myself, either with sarcasm or even violence, or maybe it would be just really pleasant to negate the world in front of me, either again with like, sarcasm or irony, or even just this idea of, if I could just like destroy what I see in front of me, maybe then I'll finally be at peace and there'll be sort of like a synchronicity between my sense of nothingness and the nothingness that I see in the world. So students immediately make this connection, like, I don't even have to do this, but they're like, well, this is like school shootings. And it's really intense because everyone sees it. We so often try to explain stuff like this in terms of psychology, in terms of sociological factors, and all those things are real. Like that's part of all of what's going on these days. But when you see that it really is about this pain of existence and a desire to annihilate something, anything, it just makes it viscerally obvious like what forces are at work. And yeah, I think this is another great moment for papers, although sometimes like this fact can be so visceral for all of us. We just kind of have this moment of like seeing together in that lovely conversation way, and then we move on because it's almost too much to bear. But yeah, it's a great moment, and she's really she's very good at describing the way that the pure relationship to non-being transforms itself into action. So there is a way past this. The next character she points out to is the adventurer. Somebody who sees the world, realizes that it doesn't have the fixed meaning that most serious people want to claim it, but also sort of reject the sort of like quietism of the subman. You go on an adventure. You're like, you know what, none of this matters a ton, but I'm going to say it matters to me, and I'm going to go and have a very good time, like becoming like, going and fighting in the Spanish Civil War or whatnot. A lot of her examples are military. She uses T. Lawrence as an example, although she says that he's better than the pure adventurer because he does respect the freedom of others. But I love to think about the Count of Monte Cristo in this regard, in that like the one thing that matters to him is perfect and utter revenge on everybody who wrongly imprisoned him, and the lover that betrayed him and so forth, married his rival that had put him in prison. And it's not till the end of the book that he realized, like, well, maybe I shouldn't have killed all those people in service of my revenge. And there you see it, like the adventurer, like he starts off on the right path. He's like, I'm free. These values rely on my participation in order to really make them real. But then he immediately starts to pin himself to the causes of serious men, like freedom in Arabia, or the Spanish Civil War, or revenge in the case of other people. So once again, the adventurers falling into that trap of like, none of the lives of you guys matter. What matters is my adventure. And again, he just is just another sort of serious person, or related to the serious person in that way. So she has like in this chapter, something like 15 to 20 different characters. She gets to talking about the way that artists try to believe in the world as maybe more than it is through their writing. Their writing becomes an idol to them. Or creatures of passion who are like, well, my emotions matter. That's how I exist in the world. Which again, then maybe the emotions of other people, et cetera, et cetera. So where she ends it, and it's still sort of in the middle of the book, but she says that to will oneself free is only ever also to will others free. And it's almost hard to picture because there's so few examples, except maybe T. Lawrence, of like how that kind of like back and forthness would take place. But everything is set up in it. All these different characters, that's the one thing that they've just been forgetting. You have to pull yourself into a responsibility for your freedom. But the second that you let slip the existence of others, you are sort of making a metaphysical faux pas. There is something that we all participate in together. And that if we could just see it and act according to it, we would be acting with morality according to this existentialist understanding of freedom. So in the context of my ethics class, it's a nice sort of continuation of Kant's treating people as ends in themselves and not means. But I think it's really lovely because Kant's like, well, just do it. Whereas she's like, look at all these ways in which we don't do it in like really like subtle ways, but it's one of the things that leads to the most sort of fissures in our relationships to other people, both individually and politically. So they really, this is one of the reasons why I think I get success in teaching Aristotle next, in that like once you're like, oh wow, this philosophy stuff, it is sort of drawing something out that I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Then when we spend like 6 to 8 weeks really carefully going through like individual virtues, people start to be like, okay, well maybe this is something that I could concretely think about doing myself. So that's why I love teaching Beauvoir, and I hope that a lot of you are interested in looking at this, particularly the second chapter.
Great. Yeah, this is so interesting. I don't know this piece, Mary, and so, but I will have read it by the time we meet again. Yeah, I have the privilege of asking the first question, but I will remind everyone who's watching that we will gather on March 11th online through Zoom to have a live conversation with Mary Townsend about these ideas, and everyone's welcome. And if you found this this video, you also have found the link to the Zoom. But if not, on the ACTC website under Core Conversations, in that drop-down menu is our Zoom link. And at March 11th, noon Eastern time, we'll gather and you can ask Mary questions. But right now, I get the first shot. Um, so many different interesting things. I love these kind of uh, gallery of actors, of ways of being in the world. I'm really drawn to that kind of approach. And probably it's just because it was the first one you were talking about, but I kind of was thinking about childhood and children the whole time you were talking. Um, because there is a kind of the adventurer is an interesting case. This idea that you would sort of attach yourself to the cause of others, which kind of, if you're self-conscious about it, um, is a reminder of your freedom, right? That you can attach yourself or detach yourself from causes. And even if you're attached to your own adventure, the precondition of that is detaching yourself from whatever life you had before you had the adventure. So it's like, for the adventure, it's sort of right in front of you, this your freedom, even if you're not entirely in touch with it. But it seems like for children, um, they they're not in touch with it really at all, because they're so perfectly in touch with it, right? There's like and so is this nostalgia for childhood, is it um is it simply a way of fleeing freedom, that is, oh gosh, I wish I were back to this unself-conscious way of being in the world, um or is it kind of like or analogous to the adventure? Is this sort of attachment to this interest we have in childhood also a kind of perhaps unself-conscious recognition of the value of freedom, even at the same time we're kind of fleeing from our present responsibilities and our present freedom by wishing ourselves back into a state of being where we didn't have to make our own choices?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really important. Because I think if childhood were simply bad, that would be difficult and it would make life pretty dark, and that like we'll simply never get back to that sort of perfect irresponsibility. But I really like the connection of like the sort of no threads attached joy in existence, because she does really think that aspect of it can really come back. And I think a lot of times when we think about being playful, or like in Plato, we like to say being playfully serious.
Mm.
There's little pockets where we do sort of come out in exactly the best aspect of that childishness. And that like we do feel like, hey, for a moment, we can just play around. We can just mess around talking to each other and really just sort of like be free in what we think about and how we relate to each other.
Yeah, I'm so interested in this, especially in one point that you made along the way is that seems related to this, is that you sort of bad actors in the world rely on the passions of the sub men. And it seems to me, and this would take more unpacking, but even though children are unselfconsciously passionate and joyful and not taking their own self in hand somehow yet, that they are less susceptible to that kind of manipulation and deployment toward bad ends, even though they're not entirely holding on to their freedom. That there's something about that unselfconscious, joyful immersion in life that actually provides some protections against the ways that submen seem to be vulnerable to manipulation.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's really, really, really true, and really interesting and worth unpacking. No, it's and I've noticed this too, and I also have memories from my own childhood.
Yeah.
Children are so suspicious of tyrants, and they're suspicious of BS, and there's something about like claiming that my absolute idea like has absolute power over you that is just it's dumb. It's obviously not true. No, kids are so great because they both like they need the ground and security of parents like and they're half angry about it, but they half also just like joyfully accept it. But the second that they see somebody like really being an asshole or tyrannical in some way, it's lovely to watch. They can sort of keep us morally honest, because they're more willing to be like sort of, we're sort of caught in like our webs of seriousness, and we're like, well, that's sort of true and that's sort of true, and children are like, no, I'm sorry, that was wrong.
Love that. All right. Well, I guess we should stop here to keep this video of a manageable length. But I'm so glad that we're going to have another opportunity to talk. And those of you who are watching the video, please do join us. This really is open to everyone, and we would love to see you March 11th, 2022, at 12 o'clock noon Eastern time on Zoom. Once again, you can find that link on the ACTC webpage under core conversations, and you can drop down to go directly to the Zoom link. Also, a reminder is the ACTC's big annual event is our conference, April 21st through 24th at the University of Notre Dame. And barring some unforeseen new variant of COVID, it appears that we will be able to go there together and sit around tables and talk about books and pedagogy and reacquaint ourselves after this far too long of an absence from one another. So please do join us online February 11th. And if you can, please, March 11th. And if you can, please do join us in person April 21st through 24th at Notre Dame. And if you need information about that, there's tons on the website, but you can also reach out to me. But for now, thanks again, Mary. This was great.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
See everybody soon.